Everyone knew in Ireland about the election of Daniel O'Connell. Bonfires were lit across every hill on the island to telegraph the news about this great victory. O'Connell himself was put in a chair in Ennis in County Clare, lifted up and carried all the way to County Limerick, miles away, by a people who were so adoring, who were so grateful, who were so triumphant. From that moment on, they gave O'Connell the name Liberator, the man who had liberated his people, and a name which he rejoiced in, a name which gave him such pride. When he stood up in Limerick then to deliver a speech to the crowd, for the first time in his life, he couldn't be heard. They just kept cheering him. They just kept applauding him. It reminds me of the speech that Bobby Kennedy tried to give at the Democratic Party National Convention in 1964, the year after the assassination of his brother. He stood up to speak, but for 18 minutes they kept interrupting with applause and cheering. That was what happened to O'Connell. And eventually he stopped and broke down laughing, saying, "You know, all my life I've been able to give speeches, but you know what? I don't care anymore. I'm just so happy. I just want to stand here and laugh with you." That was what Catholic emancipation meant to the Irish people, or at least the fact that they thought this is what's going to come now. During the campaign in Clare, an enterprising merchant had produced napkins, handkerchiefs, with O'Connell's picture on it. Green flags were put on every house to salute O'Connell, to cheer him on. A year later, when he went for re-election in the constituency, when he entered the town, he saw that instead of the green flags, they had white flags. And he turned to a friend, all disturbed, and he said, "Are they calling me a coward? What do these white flags mean?" And they said, "No, Liberator. These are the green flags of last year. They have kept them out all during the winter, and the weather has faded them white. They love you that much, they kept them out all year round." In Clare during the election, instead of saying, "God be with you," people began going around saying, "O'Connell be with you." The soldiers who had gathered had many young Irish Catholics among their numbers. One was a young boy called Ryan. And when the soldiers had gathered in formation to watch O'Connell go past after his election, the young boy ran out of formation to shake the hands, and he said, "Sir, I want to shake hands with the father of my country, the father of my nation." And when that story was reported back to the British government, they knew they would have to give in and allow Catholic emancipation. And they went to the King George IV and they said, "We can't win here. There's no rebellion to put down. There's nothing to defeat. O'Connell has been elected." And the King said, "Well, then I want a new government. I'm going to get rid of you and bring in people who will stop this." But no one was prepared to take over. And the King was forced to concede emancipation in 1829. And he said, "I am no longer the King of Ireland. Daniel O'Connell is the King of Ireland. He's King Dan. I am now just the Duke of Windsor. My power has been broken." But the King was vicious and bitter. And he said, Catholic emancipation will only apply to those elected after 1829, meaning O'Connell would not be allowed to take his seat. And that was to prove an interesting incident. You also see during that campaign, O'Connell was able to call upon a lot of supporters in the Catholic Church, including a man called Father Tom Maguire. Now, O'Connell had defended Tom Maguire the previous year because Tom Maguire had been accused of having an affair with a young Protestant girl called Anne McGarrahan, and of having even married her. And then when she became pregnant, of abandoning her, and then she went to England where she suffered a miscarriage. And O'Connell defended Tom Maguire. And looking back on the case, I for one am convinced that Father Tom Maguire was guilty. I think now in the 21st century, we don't have that much difficulty believing that a young charismatic priest may have an affair with a young girl. And certainly there seemed a lot of evidence, a lot of witnesses. O'Connell himself didn't call a lot of his own witnesses because he knew they would incriminate Father Tom Maguire. But O'Connell won the case by destroying the character of Anne McGarrahan. He put her on the witness stand and he said, "I like the clothes you're wearing. You're wearing very nice clothes. How many men did you have to sleep with to get those clothes?" He said, "This woman has never been pregnant, although she slept with enough men that I'm surprised that she's never been pregnant. He denied that a child had ever been conceived. And he went out of his way to say, how could a man as pure as my kind have stooped from his heavenly feast to feed on such wretched carrion as this? What beauty, what joy is there in her? And he won the case by destroying her. And I think that also shows the kind of the nastiness of O'Connell as well, his nasty side, the way he would do anything to win the case. Well, Tom Maguire repaid the favour by leading a group down to Clare in 1828 to campaign for O'Connell and win him that case. After the winning of Emancipation, though, O'Connell decided to give up on his career as a barrister, to give up on his career as a lawyer. He said, after all of that excitement, all of that glory, how could I ever just get any joy or adrenaline by just being a lawyer in the courts? And they said, but your big mission is over. What's left? And he said, well, there is always repeal of the Union. And that was what he was going to devote himself to next. There was one time, well, he went back to the law courts a few times in the 1830s. One time in 1836, he was representing Dublin Corporation and a man called Charles Halliday, and he was completely unprepared. And he stood up and delivered a speech denouncing the side and saying, this is terrible and that's wrong and that's wrong. And then he sat down and Halliday whispered to him and he said, you've got it all wrong. We're on the opposite side. So O'Connell stood up and he said, now, my lord, what you just heard there was an example of some of the arguments that the other side will use. And allow me now to show why they're all wrong. And let me go through them point by point. And completely won the case, even though he had started off on the wrong side. But from that point on, he devoted his career to being a parliamentarian in Britain and fighting to restore the Irish Parliament in Dublin. But first he had to take his seat. And because the King had deliberately excluded O'Connell from the Repeal Act, it meant that when he presented himself at the bar of the House of Commons in 1829, he had to take all of the existing oaths or he wouldn't be allowed to take a seat. So people didn't know what O'Connell would do. Would he take the oaths? Would he back down? What would happen? The House of Commons was packed. Everyone wanted to see the great Irish orator. What would he be like in the British House of Commons? How good would he really be? Was his reputation deserved? The future King of France was in the public gallery. The public gallery was thronged with onlookers, excited men and women who wanted to see the Irish liberator, the Irish chieftain in action. And O'Connell presented himself to the House of Commons to take his seat. And the clerk of the Commons came up and he said, well, Mr. O'Connell, before we can let you take your seat, you will have to take the oaths. Will you take them? And O'Connell frowned and he said, can I see them? And the clerk said, oh, okay. And he went behind the table and he took out a few pieces of card that had the various oaths written on them and he handed them to O'Connell. And O'Connell looked at them and he put his hand in his jacket, took out his spectacles and put them on and rested them on his nose. And for 2 minutes, he just began reading them to himself, as if he had never seen them before in his life. And there was hushed silence, as everyone waited to see what he would do. And as O'Connell read these oaths, he read these oaths that had insulted the Irish Catholics for centuries, the oaths that all members of Parliament had to take, but which under the new Emancipation Act had been changed to just oaths of loyalty, like Pitt had wanted in 1801. They were oaths that said that the entire practices of the Catholic Church were impious and idolatrous, denied the worship of the Blessed Virgin Mary, denied transubstantiation, basically insulted everything that the Catholics believed in. So that for an Irish Catholic to take these oaths would have been to insult the Irish people, would have been to betray everything that they believed in and to betray his status as a leader. But O'Connell acted as if he had never seen them before in his life as he read them to himself. And finally, he looked up and he said, well, I don't think I can take these. There's one part here that I know for a fact is untrue. There's another part here that I think is untrue. and the rest is ridiculous. And with that, he flung the cards across the table, flung them across the chamber, turned around and walked out. And that was considered one of Daniel O'Connell's greatest victories in the British House of Commons, even though he hadn't been actually allowed to take his seat, because he had stood up and vindicated the rights of the Irish Catholics, and he had said his piece about why these oaths had for centuries been a disgrace and why they should not have been allowed. And so he ran for re-election in County Clare, and he was unopposed. And so he took his seat in 1830 as a member, finally, of the British House of Commons. And just think about that, 1830. He was by now 55 years of age. 55 years of age, and he was starting on his new career. For the past 30 years, he had been fighting for that right to sit in Parliament. And now the great challenge of his life was before him, to become a member of an Irish Parliament, to win repeal, to repeal the Act of Union, restore a Dublin Parliament where Catholics and Protestants could sit together. Now, the Catholic Emancipation movement of the 1820s had a number of Protestant supporters, and O'Connell went out of his way to try and build a unity with Protestants in the 1830s, to show that this wasn't really just a Catholic movement. The problem was that because he had enlisted the support of the Catholic priests, the bishops, the Catholic rent being collected at Catholic masses, it meant that it became very closely associated with the Catholic religion. And that proved to be a big weakness in Irish nationalism in the years ahead. You could say it became a big problem for the Irish state then in the 20th century, that Irish nationalism became equated with Catholicism, even though so many of the great Irish leaders, from Tone and Emmet all the way to Davis and Parnell, were Protestant. And that uneasy coalition, that uneasy conflation of nationalism and Catholicism was not something that O'Connell wanted. It's something that certainly he has been blamed for, but it's not something that he wanted. And he did try to broaden out the appeal in the 1830s, even going so far as to go to the Boyne, the scene of William of Orange's victory over the Catholic James II in 1690, and drink the waters of the Boyne, to toast the memory of King William of Orange, to add an orange ribbon to the green ribbon on the medallion he would wear around his neck, to show orange and Catholic, orange and green, nationalist and unionist can be, Catholic and Protestant can be united together. But he wasn't really very successful in that, although he still had some supporters in that. And that was, I suppose, the downside of a lot of what O'Connell was doing. As an MP in the British House of Commons, he marked himself out as one of the greatest parliamentarians of the age. He could make the MPs laugh one minute and cry the next. Charles Dickens, before he became the great novelist, was a parliamentary reporter. And he reported on O'Connell's speeches. And he later said that he was forced to put down his pencil because he was so carried away by the emotion of O'Connell's speeches. And that he would sometimes later actually include some of these stories of O'Connell's in his own novels. The Old Curiosity Shop has Nell and her grandfather wandering the countryside over the bodies of the dead. They were inspired by O'Connell's stories of the horrors of the 1798 rebellion and the people that were massacred. Funnily enough, that was the novel of Dickens that O'Connell hated, and he hated it after Nell was killed, and he was reading it on a train, and he was so disgusted he threw it out the window of the train because he was so shocked. But he continued to read Dickens, and he loved the account that Dickens wrote denouncing American slavery in the 1840s, and O'Connell appears himself off stage in one of Dickens's novels, Martin Chuzzlewit, where they discuss O'Connell's great role as an abolitionist and how that alienated some of the Irish-American groups. But O'Connell in the 1830s, even though he was a great speaker, even though he was a great orator, proved unable to convince the British people, the British parliamentarians, to grant Ireland its own parliament. And so he realised he would have to lead an entirely new campaign.